is SMNI News Channel. Truth that matters.
Good evening. You're watching SMNI. This is Business and Politics. I'm your host, Dante Klinkang. For this episode, we will tackle issues related to the South China Sea, or as Filipinos call it, the West Philippine Sea. The area has been attracting global attention as tensions rise between China and the United States. In the middle of that mix is the Philippines. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. said that the country's foreign policy is to be a friend to all and an enemy to no one. But how can the Philippines execute a delicate balancing act, referring, of course, to its relations with those two competing superpowers? To help us answer that, we have invited Dr. Renato De Castro, a distinguished professor at the Department of International Studies in De La Salle University, Manila. There, he holds a Dr. Aurelio Calderon Chair in Philippine-American Relations. Professor De Castro served as a consultant to the National Security Advisor during the Aquino administration. He conducts professional courses in international relations, strategic and security studies at the National Defense College, Special Intelligence Training School of the Intelligence Service of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, General Staff and Command College of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and the Foreign Service Institute. He is also a member of the Albert Del Rosario Institute of Strategic and International Studies Board of Trustees. Given his background on security issues and foreign relations, our discussion will focus on how should the Philippines navigate the brewing geopolitical storm ahead. Prof?
Good evening.
Dr. De Castro, do you mind if I call you Rene?
Yeah, please do.
Welcome, sir, to...
Can I call you Click?
Of course, absolutely. Welcome, sir, to Business and Politics, and thank you for making time. Sir, this is, I think, a privilege for us to talk to someone who briefs our security officials on the security situations that we face. And there are many issues that we'd like to talk to you about.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you gave me the opportunity to at least express my views to the wider public about how we have to consider developments that are happening abroad that will definitely have impact on us as a nation.
Sir, first,
Rene.
Rene, let me ask you first about your reading of the things that are going on. What's in the news are, of course, the EDCA sites that were revealed. I mean, at least the names were formally announced now. We have the Balikatan exercises, supposedly the biggest one of the series of those military drills. We had the resumption of the 2+2 meeting between Secretary Galvez and Secretary Manalo and their counterparts in the U.S. And of course, the other side of that is we have these tensions brewing in China with regard to its claim on Taiwan. There are many drills going on in the region. How do you see these things? Are these things to be worried about, or are these simply par for the course? What's the expert view?
Yeah, I'll say that it's a very challenging period. And this period is basically marked by an emergence of a great power who wants to basically pull its weight in the international community. Of course, I'm referring to China.
Okay.
Everyone has to remember what Napoleon Bonaparte said.
Yes.
At the onset of the 1800s, just before Battle of Waterloo.
Let the sleeping dogs lie.
China is a sleeping dragon.
Yeah.
Don't stir it up, because once it awakens, it will shake the world. Now we are witnessing this at this point in time.
Okay. And how does that impact the global politics now? I mean, are we seeing, as some say, the beginning of a new Cold War, or is that an exaggerated reaction to what is going on?
Okay.
What do you see?
So China would like to basically say, I am a power to reckon with.
Okay.
The current international society has been created without me.
Okay.
Or when China, of course, was suffering from what it calls a century of shame and humiliation.
Right.
And of course, during the time of Mao Zedong up to the 1980s, 1990s, China was not a power to reckon with.
Okay.
But of course, a lot of things changed in a matter of 2 decades. China became, China has the second largest economy in the world. It created, of course, a sense of confidence that it's time for China to basically find its place in the sun.
Okay.
So that's basically what's happening. And of course,
Okay.
you have the reaction from a status quo superpower, the United States,
Okay.
that, I will not simply allow you to pull your weight around.
Okay.
You have to take into account that although I'm not part of the Indo-Pacific region, I am a resident power here, I have my interests here, I have my alliances here, and of course, I have a role as the strategic offshore balancer.
Okay.
I would have to basically ensure the freedom of navigation in the waters in the Western Pacific. So you have to take into account my presence. Unfortunately, of course, we are caught in the middle.
Okay. Do you think, I'm just playing devil's advocate
Sure.
here, Renato, that maybe there is an argument to be made for viewing China from the lens of the West, and that is when a power rises, it becomes expansionary, and that there is not much credit given to China's history itself, where it became the Middle Kingdom, and yet its behavior was not to expand, but was to exclude the world. Everyone outside of China was essentially barbarians to to the Middle Kingdom. What do you think of that view?
For one thing, of course, if you have to look at Chinese history,
Okay.
China has always identified itself as an empire,
Okay.
based on the dynasty.
Yes.
And historically, when empires are strong, they
Okay.
expand.
Okay.
So you look at Chinese history, starting, of course, from the Qin, Han, Sung. If you have, of course, the imperial dynasty powerful, the tendency is to expand.
Okay.
So, we are at this point in time that China is strong, China is powerful, China still has this mentality that I'm the middle kingdom, I'm the middle power.
Yeah.
Before the West came here, I maintained the tributary system, when China is, of course, the center of the region. So from the Chinese perspective, there's been an anomaly because the West came here. Now we have to go back to the normal. The normal is China is the middle kingdom. China, of course, is the power to reckon with.
Right.
This is how China views the world.
Okay. Let me press you a bit.
Sure.
Renato. So, some people would say that China was more concerned, just looking at history, China would say that it has never really expanded as you were describing it. Maybe some say consolidating, right? It's different kingdoms within China, but it didn't really go beyond that kingdom.
Okay.
And that the tributary thing. So there's another story behind it, and I guess after that episode of the Chinese naval expansion in history, that they really went back and really became insular and really wanted more to isolate themselves from the rest of the world.
Probably that was the time. But you have a number of interventions that happened,
Okay.
of course, in the 20th century.
Okay.
Number one, of course, you have the Chinese Revolution.
Okay.
From the Chinese perspective, it's a way for us to redeem ourselves
Okay.
from the century of shame and humiliation.
Okay.
Plus, of course, you have the Communist Party coming into power.
Okay.
In 1949, during the creation of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong made this speech.
Okay.
We would have to assert our power. We should never allow other powers to, of course, make China weak, or we would suffer again that century of humiliation. So this is the commitment of the Communist Party of China.
Yeah.
China should remain powerful, should remain as strong as ever. Then, of course, you have the dramatic reform initiated by Deng Xiaoping, the modernization program. Then, of course, going back to the 21st century, China achieved this goal. And, of course, China right now is ruled by a President Xi Jinping, who's basically has this vision.
Unprecedented
power, and
yeah.
the fact that, he has this ambition.
Yeah.
His ambition, of course, is to ensure that China would again ever experience any decline. Challenging, of course, the notion of, the history of empires. If empires are powerful, they would expand. If empires are weak, they would contract. So the goal of the Communist Party under President Xi Jinping is to prevent this cycle from ever happening again.
Yeah. I want to ask you about two comments I've heard from the American side. We were talking earlier about Professor Graham Allison of Harvard University came up with this concept about the Thucydides trap that basically said that, you know, rising powers tend to threaten existing powers. But he, you know, as we were discussing, he didn't say that that was a conclusion. That there are many things that can happen to prevent war. What are your thoughts? Does it apply to what we're seeing now?
Yes, in a way, yes.
In the West Philippine Sea?
But also in the same book, he mentioned this. He was referring to a forest fire,
war, right? Yeah.
Forest fire during summer.
Yeah.
So you already have the air becoming dry.
Okay.
You don't have any rain. You have a lot of dry leaves, a lot of dry trees. But that will not simply trigger a forest fire.
Okay.
You need a spark, a flame.
Okay.
So the condition is there, the necessary condition is there. You simply need that sufficient condition where somebody would have to throw, a flame that will trigger a forest fire.
Are we in that situation now where the conditions are ripe?
Yeah, the conditions are ripe, but it could still be managed if we are wise enough, or the two powers are wise enough to prevent that spark from being, of course, triggered.
Okay. Now, given that, what therefore is the Philippine interest? Are we committed to maybe this seemingly stopless train that's headed for conflict, or does our interest lie somewhere else? You know, some would say, and we've said this also in the Manila Times, that maybe our interest lies in keeping the peace.
Well,
what is your view?
That's our interest, to maintain the peace.
Okay.
But unfortunately, we are, of course, prisoners of geography.
Okay.
Or, of course, what Robert Kaplan would call, we have to, of course, witness the revenge of history.
Okay.
Our location, basically, right in the middle, of these two great powers.
Right.
China is in our backyard, and of course, historically, the Philippines has been the base of, U.S. exercise of playing that role of a Pacific power, beginning, of course, when we became a territory of the United States,
right?
1898.
So going back to Graham Allison, right? What would you think he would recommend to foreign policymakers here in the Philippines? Because he said that war was not a foregone conclusion, right? He said the conditions are ripe, but you can still do something about it. So what would be, if Graham Allison you think would be advising us, what would you think the correct foreign policy stand should be?
Well, one thing we have to be very careful. Of course, we have to take into account. Now, we're not just a neutral player here.
Okay.
We have a territorial dispute with China.
Okay.
China wants to deprive us of 85% of our exclusive economic zone.
Okay.
You have the Chinese People's Liberation Army's Navy, Coast Guard, and civilian militia operating in our waters.
Okay.
So we're confronted with that situation. And of course, we're also a treaty ally of the United States.
Okay.
So at this point in time, the only thing we could do is to prevent, any incident that might trigger this forest fire.
And do we have leverage? I mean, very quickly.
We have to be very careful. I still remember when I was working in the National Security Council under General Cesar Garcia, we have to give instructions to our Navy ships and our Coast Guard vessels. Make sure that you exercise extreme caution.
Maximum restraint.
Because, once we get involved in a conflict, we have a treaty ally who might just decide, although you're not invoking the Mutual Defense Treaty because, simply I have beef against China, then of course I will honor the treaty commitment.
Right.
Then of course China would also expect the worst.
Yeah.
The Philippines will automatically be assisted by the United States, so we have to make that action.
Yeah.
So we have to tread it carefully.
Yeah. Well,
of course, recognizing the fact that we are still a treaty ally of the United States. It's a policy of the current president to strengthen that alliance relations for one reason or the other.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Right now, we'll just have to take a quick break. This is Business and Politics. We'll be right back.
Did you know that water is the only drink that can quench your thirst? Drink Galilee Purified Drinking Water. Every bottle undergoes advanced scientific process to ensure a safe, clean, and pure bottle. So what are you waiting for? Drink Galilee drinking water. Every bottle is a labor of love. For delivery, contact Galilee Purified Drinking Water at 0956-658-4195 or 0998-466-0202 or 8572-1869.
Inapi ka ba? Nilabag ba ang karapatan mo habang nagtatrabaho sa ibang bansa? Narito na ang programang tutugon sa mga problemang legal na kinakaharap ng mga overseas Filipino workers. OFW Helpline. Kasama ang batikang abogado para sa kapakanan ng mga OFW, si Attorney David Castillon at SMNI correspondents na sina Hannah Jane Sancho at Paul Montibon. Mapapanood tuwing Biyernes alas 10 hanggang alas 11 ng gabi. Dito lamang sa SMNI. OFW Helpline. Ang totoong boses ng mga overseas Filipino workers.
I, Rodrigo Roa Duterte.
Rodrigo Roa Duterte, former President of the Philippines. Former Davao City Mayor. Well-loved Filipino public servant. Talks to the nation once again with its popular public service program, Gikan sa Masa para sa Masa.
I look forward to the resumption of my original program way back, Gikan sa Masa para sa Masa. Great expectation. Everything that is relevant to the lives of the Filipinos, issues that will affect our everyday, whatever, anything under the sun.
Catch it live weekly on SMNI. In the spirit of nation building, only here on SMNI.
Welcome back to SMNI. This is Business and Politics. We're talking to Professor Renato De Castro of De La Salle University. Sir, I said that I wanted to ask you about two professors, besides Graham Allison. The other one, I'm not sure you're familiar with Jeffrey Sachs, whose work is really more focused on poverty alleviation. But he's been sort of the alternate view, offering the alternate view in the U.S. about China. And his point was that the Americans should not be afraid of China because all the Chinese want really are the same things that Americans want. That they only want their own share of the pie, so to speak. What do you think? Would you agree with his reading of the Chinese based on what you know?
Yes, I will agree with him.
Okay.
Starting from the assumption that the Chinese are just like, the Americans of what they want. Because let's go back to why did the United States became first a regional power and of course eventually a superpower. Yeah. So it started of course with the Monroe Doctrine, and later of course 100 years later, by the time of President Theodore Roosevelt, you have the Roosevelt corollary. Yeah. This means driving away the European powers from the Western Hemisphere. The United States became a global power because it became the leading or hegemonic power in the Western Hemisphere by refusing to allow any external power. That is the same thing that China wants. China wants also to become a power here in the region, and by becoming the dominant power here, it means driving away the United States. Basically preventing the United States Navy from, of course, conducting its offshore strategic balancing to the region. So I will agree with him.
That's interesting. You know, foreign policy, and I'm not an expert in any way at all, but it seems to me, and I'm more familiar with economic theory. I don't know if you've heard of Thorstein Veblen, and his theory was basically that, unlike what Marx was saying, that there's no really class struggle, that the underprivileged class really want to be the upper class.
Okay.
And so in a sense, what you were saying is that in saying that the Chinese want what the Americans want, they don't want to really fight the Americans. They want to be the new Americans.
They want to drive away the Americans from this region because they want to play the role that the United States is playing right now in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay.
Based on the Monroe Doctrine and, of course, the Roosevelt Corollary.
Yeah.
There's only one dominant power here in the Western Hemisphere. China would also want to have that, that status, the only dominant power in the region. And this is captured by the grand strategy of the President Xi Jinping, the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which basically means Asians should resolve Asian problems alone.
Right. Well, now that brings me to my point, because I think the first time we met, I asked you about the pronouncements of President Marcos, and I wanted to hear about your take on his foreign policy. Given all of these dynamics, what then now is the prudent course, for the Philippines? How do we move forward?
Okay, of course, I will talk about in terms of the design.
Okay.
The president, of course, is the architect of Philippine foreign policy.
Sure.
This is the design, but what is the reality?
Sure.
Of course, he is very clear-minded about it. The design is a balanced policy. Hopefully, these two powers will be able to, we play a balancing role. We would rely on China for the economic opportunities, market investment, public investment for the building up of our infrastructure. But he learned something from his previous administration.
Okay.
You cannot simply lean on the Chinese because you still have issue when it comes to the South China Sea.
Okay.
So he decided to revitalize our alliance with the United States.
Okay.
So the approach is supposed to be balanced.
Okay.
But then suddenly, of course, he's confronted with the reality.
Okay.
The Chinese would, of course, want to engage us economically, but they will never offer any concession.
Okay.
When it comes to the West Philippine Sea issue, South China Sea issue.
Okay.
China also wants to expand into our maritime domain. And of course, the purpose is to simply push out the United States Navy from operating here.
Okay.
Then, of course, it's only recourse to action, given the fact that China will not allow our survey vessels to conduct explorations at the Reed Bank. Chinese Coast Guard and Navy are, of course, still harassing our Navy and Coast Guard vessels, and to even point that the Chinese Coast Guard is even driving away ordinary fishing folks. So he was, of course, forced to revitalize our alliance with the United States. So that's the reality we face right now.
Right. I think the first time we met, I don't know if you remember, I was asking you about a specific quote that we heard from President Marcos, which is that we don't have any territorial disputes with China, but what we have are Chinese claims on Philippine territory, or something to that effect. And could you maybe refresh us on what your views are? Is that the correct approach?
Of course,
because to a layman, it sounds like a play on words, but of course, to a foreign policy, it seems there's a different tone to it or message to it.
This is a subtle recognition of the arbitral ruling.
Okay.
Because the arbitral ruling rejected China's 9-9 claim.
Okay.
So China has no business really entering into our maritime domain because the arbitral ruling, of course, based on the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, states that China simply doesn't have any claim, legal claim. So what China is doing is simply intruding into what we considered our maritime domain.
Okay.
This is the same speech that he delivered, I think, in Cebu.
Okay.
During the exchange of command in the Western Command, when he told the Armed Forces of the Philippines, historically, our maritime borders have been secure.
Okay.
Now you have a power that is basically, challenging what has been considered as accepted, that we have this maritime domain.
Right.
And obviously, I think he's referring to China.
Right. And there's something that some people say that maybe the Philippine relations with China should not be defined by our problems in the West Philippine Sea, because there are other aspects of bilateral relations, people to people. You mentioned economic relations. Is there room for that, you think? And if there is, how do we put those non-confrontational aspects of relations at the forefront instead of these things that are, to be very frank, very worrying.
Well, that is, of course, our view as a middle power.
Okay.
That's basically our message to China. But the problem is China doesn't see it that way.
Okay.
China views it from a wider perspective as a great power. And, of course, also view it from in terms of its objective vis-a-vis the United States.
Okay.
So for the Chinese, for us, probably the issue with the West Philippine Sea is primarily economic. For the Chinese, it's strategic, military. Control, so I could prevent the United States Navy from operating here.
Okay.
So China would have to assume the role of a zero-sum player.
Okay.
The South China Sea, as of course mentioned even earlier than 2010, is part of China's core interests.
Okay.
And when China talks about core interests, Taiwan, Tibet, and the South China Sea, those issues are, of course, non-negotiable.
Right, right. But again, playing devil's advocate for there, right? So just to understand things, doesn't it work against China's own interest, maybe to see all of these tensions escalating, because it's so dialed into the global economy, right? Except maybe for the past few years, for a while, China was even known as the factory of the world. It relies on and thrives on trade with the world, and all of these things that are happening, of course, impact on the economic side of relations. As we are seeing it, there's a trade war going on between the U.S. and China. There are now maybe some signs of that, that may be going on between the Philippines and China. What do you think about that argument that to view China as hostile would be in a way incongruent because it works against their self-interest?
Well, you also have to understand how China looks at the world.
Okay.
It has a lot of things that happened, of course, ever since President Xi Jinping took over.
Okay.
So, of course, you're talking about China during the time of Deng Xiaoping. Looking at reforms, looking at the possibility of being integrated into the greater market as a goal. Everything has changed, of course, with President Xi Jinping.
Okay.
His goal is basically to impress upon the world that we are a power to reckon with. We have some issues, 3 issues that we have to resolve. Number 1, the most important is Taiwan.
Right.
Second is, of course, Tibet. And the third one is, of course, the South China Sea.
Yeah.
And when it comes to this issue, they're non-negotiable. And, of course, we are very conscious of the fact that we have the 2nd largest economy in the world. We're building a navy, of course, that has become the largest in terms of quantity.
Yeah.
And, of course, the fact that China, the Communist Party, has successfully mobilized the national sentiment.
Yeah.
It had promised to the Chinese nation that we will make sure that China would remain powerful as ever, and we will not anymore suffer decline or any possibility of experiencing again the century of shame and humiliation. So we need all your support.
Yeah.
So, and this is very much reflected in the report of the 20th Party Congress last October.
Okay.
That China's view of the world has changed.
Okay.
Number 1, they started talking about the stormy sea.
Yeah.
And it's time that China would have to minimize its dependence on the global market.
Okay.
And start to focus more on building up the domestic economy.
And we're seeing that now, right?
We're seeing it now.
Right,
It's
right.
China
Right.
of, let's say, the period of President Hu Jintao and President Xi Jinping has totally changed.
Right. Now, going back to Graham Allison, why can't we have China rising in the same way as we saw maybe Japan rise in the 1980s, right? Where it didn't seem to cause or stir so much anxiety. For a while in the 80s, I remember there were people concerned about Japanese companies buying American companies and how Japanese companies would dominate the world and eclipse American corporations. But I don't seem to remember a similar concern or anxiety that we seem to attach to China's rise. What do you think?
Well, number 1, China is a continental power.
Okay.
It is the largest country in the region. It has this history of being the Middle Kingdom.
Okay.
Plus, of course, China is ruled by a Communist Party.
Okay. Yeah.
That has to basically ensure that it remains in power without any popular election. Will have to justify.
Okay.
It's, of course, its rule in terms, number 1, of economic development. Now that China has achieved this economic development, the promise now to the Chinese people is, of course, China should be on the same level as the United States by 2049, and China
By
would
100
have,
years of,
100, have to resolve all the standing issues: Tibet, Taiwan, South China Sea, and of course also impressing upon other countries. More importantly, over Japan, that I'm the power to reckon with, not that external power, which is of course the United States.
Now, I'll ask you about Philippine policy, but right now we'll just have to take another quick break. This is SMNI's Business and Politics. Please stay tuned.
S&D Grill. Our commitment is good food for all occasion. S&D Grill Catering Services will be there to help you celebrate your special days. S&D Grill will deliver food and service at its best. So for your parties, meetings, and gatherings, S&D will give you the taste of excellence. For bookings, contact S&D Grill at 0905-345-4754. S&D Grill. Our commitment is best service.
Kanang inyong mga cellphone, pagbantay mo sa inyong mga isultihan na mo sa una. Pornography is a spiritual adultery. Kanang pornography, labaw pa na sa shabu. Magdaot imong uto ka na, labi na kung ikaw niya ka sa kingdom ministry, paingon taglangit, mauna imong kalaban. Because it will destroy everything that was implanted to you spiritually that will let you go to heaven. Pornography is the number one missile of the enemy that will destroy you and your soul to hell. Ayaw jud mo pagtanaw pornography, babaeng lalaki sa inyo. What is dangerous now with cell phones? You can go to the privacy of your room and look at your cell phone without anyone. Only God knows what are you looking at. And mostly, people go to the dark side of the door going to destruction to hell. And that is pornography. It destroys the mind. It destroys the soul. It destroys your spirit.
Welcome back to SMNI. This is Business and Politics. We're talking to Renato De Castro of De La Salle University. Sir, again, maybe let me circle back. Given all of these things that we have been talking about, what do we do, or is there anything we can do on the at least the foreign policy front?
Well, of course, the trajectory right now, of course, is to strengthen the alliance, and of course, this is in lieu of the fact that from the perception of the president, we are dealing with China that's playing a very uncompromising game, a zero-sum game, and extremely very assertive in terms of its effort to control 85% of the South China Sea, and of course would lead for us to lose about almost 85% of our exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea. So the only option for him right now, from his perspective, is to gravitate closer to the United States, so we could basically effect a certain balance against what is perceived as a very uncompromising China.
What do you make of the recent news that the Philippine government maybe again consider joint oil explorations in the South China Sea? Is that a logical move to you, given the recent developments that we're seeing, all of these tensions rising? What's your take on that?
We're going back to full circle.
Okay.
That was attempted by the Duterte administration in 2008.
Okay. Yes.
Of course, the limit regarding, of course, joint exploration is the fact that it has to conform to our constitution.
60-40.
60-40, and of course, So the option that was tried, of course, by the Duterte administration under Secretary Teodoro Locsin was a service contracting.
Okay.
So of course,
Which would have been consistent with
consistent with our constitution.
But the Chinese wanted to renegotiate that after.
I think the main reason is the fact that the implication here is that China would, of course, recognize and acknowledge our territorial rights in the South China Sea.
But the question is, why would they agree to it and then retreat?
That's probably they did think
Okay.
that would be the implication, because the service contracting procedure, of course, based on the explanation of my good friend, Justice Antonio Carpio, is that you will have a Filipino company that will be given the go signal by the Philippine government to conduct that exploration and possible exploitation. Then it will subcontract a Chinese company who will actually do the dirty job. But then, the Chinese realize if they sign this agreement with the Philippines, they acknowledge Philippine law and they acknowledge our territorial rights over Reed Bank.
By default, yeah.
And that will, of course, mean China would be compromising. China would appear weak. China would lose that part of what it calls, waters within the 9-dash line.
But do you think there is merit to revisiting that? I know that, having an arrangement that contradicts our constitution is a non-starter for the Philippines. But there's also some people who are saying that maybe having this type of joint project with the Chinese may be one way to tamp down the temperature in the South China Sea by focusing on cooperation rather than competition. Is there merit to that view?
Yes, of course, the main challenge here is China is also willing to compromise.
Okay.
It takes two to tango.
Okay.
But the Chinese has always been uncompromising when it comes to this.
Okay. But again, let me press you on that. Is it one Chinese view? Because a lot of, some people would say that, just like the Philippines, that there are many competing voices.
I agree, yeah.
Right? That the Chinese are not a monolith, right? That there are, of course, diplomats or doves and hawks like there are in the Philippines. But what can be done, I guess, so that, more of their doves talk to our doves rather than their hawks talking to our hawks?
Yeah, that's ideal. I have no disagreement.
What can be done?
But the problem is when it comes to the West Philippine Sea issue, South China Sea issue,
it's very contentious.
It's very contentious, especially on the part of the Chinese.
Yeah.
The policy has been basically hijacked by the PLA.
Right.
And of course, also the People's Liberation Army's Navy, along with the Coast Guard under the Oceanographic Affairs. So it basically takes a hardline approach. More significantly, of course, is the fact that the president of China right now, President Xi Jinping, is a known hardliner when it comes to territorial disputes, territorial issues.
Our common friend, we were talking about her earlier, Dr. Clarita Carlos, who was with the NSA, at one time had brought up the possibility of maybe coming up with a fishing agreement with the Chinese. What do you think of that approach? Maybe along the lines of what we were talking about earlier, about joint oil exploration, maybe finding other ways or other areas where cooperation could be
explored.
Could be possible. What would be the right conditions for the Philippines to consider that?
Well, the problem is also from the perspective of Chinese. The Chinese always look at Philippine action as something, always under the shadow of Washington, D.C.
Okay, so they suspect
that. They always suspect that behind every action, even when we filed the case against China in the Permanent Court of Arbitration, although in reality, we never consulted the Americans. What's the point of consulting the United States? Anyway, the United States is not a party to the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. China would always view it that's something. We got the message all the way from Washington, D.C.
Okay.
So that's a challenge here.
So how do we act now in a way that, of course, serves our national interest without necessarily sending the wrong message to the Chinese that we are doing America's bidding, that we are instead behaving in our own interest? I'm talking about, of course, EDCA, the Balikatan exercises. I mean, people would say that the Philippines should develop at least a minimum credible defense.
That's the point. Yeah.
Right. But how do we do that without necessarily antagonizing China and making things worse?
Well, of course, President Marcos has already indicated. He sent a number of signals. Number one, he explained that we are not hosting American bases.
Okay.
EDCA, of course, EDCA locations, EDCA sites are within Philippine bases. Okay. There are no American bases here. And of course, his assurance that he expressed to China 2 or 3 days ago, that this is primarily a defensive action.
Okay.
Basically impressing both to the Chinese and Americans, we'll try our best to have control over American forces if they are, of course, deployed in those Philippine bases.
Okay.
Hopefully that would assure China.
Right.
But we simply don't know how it is viewed, of course, in Beijing.
Yeah. Well, my reading is that it's being read very skeptically by the
Yes.
Chinese. I don't know if your
Yeah, I think so,
impression-
because they also looking at it not only in terms of the West Philippine Sea, they're also looking at it in terms of Taiwan,
Yes.
which to them is the most important core interest.
Right. So I guess that's the question, right? I mean, how do we give assurances, or can we give assurances?
Well, we can give assurances,
Yeah.
but whether those assurances would be, of course, be accepted by the Chinese is not another matter.
Right. Because when you look at the reactions from China, they're saying things like actions speak louder than words. And if you read that, we could throw back the same comments
Yes,
to the Chinese, right? That they say they want peace, and yet they're claiming territories that belong to the Philippines.
Yes.
But that's a circuitous
Yes.
discussion. How do we get out of that? I mean, what is the best way? What do you think?
Well, we have to understand what we can do, what are our limits,
Yeah.
and of course also take into account what we can do at this point in time.
Right.
Again, the challenge here, of course, is that both countries have what we call a bad faith view of each other.
Yes, yes. How do we, that's the point. How do we get back to there's some semblance of trust? I mean, do we need another party to maybe help us out? Does ASEAN
Now,
have
my
a
take here
role?
is this. China is the emergent power.
Okay,
China has greater responsibility to the region to assure all countries in the region that my intentions would not harm your interests.
so it's not our burden.
It's not our burden.
Okay.
It's the burden of the emergent power.
Okay. I'm not sure if you were following the Bao Forum lately. This is the Chinese version of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Singapore's Prime Minister Lee was there. And one of the comments he made at that event was that the big powers have to behave
Yes.
responsibly.
Yes, yes.
And of course, it was not only referring to China, but also referring to the United States, and that they have the responsibility to be good actors. How can we make that message sink in? Because, as you said, they have they don't have to listen to us because we are the lesser power in the table in the situation here.
Well, between these two great powers, China and the United States, China, of course, has the greater responsibility.
Okay.
Because China is the one that's trying to change
Okay.
the international order.
Okay.
So we have to assure not only us here in the region, but even the United States that, I'm changing the order given the fact that I'm powerful. I
Right.
have the means to change this order, but not at your expense. It will not be a zero-sum game.
Right.
China often accuses country, the Philippines, especially the United States. I don't want you, to play a zero-sum game.
Right.
But China also would have to look at itself.
Yeah.
China itself is, of course, playing a zero-sum game
Right.
by trying to push the United States out of the region.
Right.
So
But-
I think the burden is really on
Yeah.
China.
But the problem with that is that we can't control what others do, right? And we can only control what we do, right? And how do we now try to pursue our economic interests? You can't not trade with China. We just recently ratified RCEP. Obviously, trading with China and RCEP is beneficial to the Philippines. Getting investments from China will be beneficial for the Philippines. How do we do that? President Marcos was just in Beijing in January, but of course, right after that, there was an announcement on EDCA. How do we now follow through on? I think there were like 13 or 14 commitments made during that Beijing visit. Well, what do we do?
Well, I think the challenge for us is not to be simply dependent on China.
Okay.
I think we have to basically look in terms of diversification.
Okay.
You have Japan, still have
Okay.
the third largest economy in the world. Major infrastructure projects here are being, of course, funded by the Japanese.
Right.
We also have to look at South Korea. We even have to look at the European Union.
Right.
So again, just to avoid us from being caught in the middle
Right.
of two competing powers. In terms of economics, the rule of the thumb is diversification.
Right.
Also in respect here, we have the United States as an ally, but we also have to explore security partnerships with other like-minded countries. And of course, we also have to rely on ASEAN.
I see. So in trade and security, would it be too correct to say don't put all your eggs in one basket?
That's
Okay.
it.
All right.
That's easier said than done, of course.
Yeah, of course. We'll be right back with Professor Renato De Castro. This is SMNI. Please stay tuned.
Tama! Tumpak! Ganda ng programa, talagang makatutulong.
Mali, hindi naman lahat afford yan eh.
Setup to, demolition job. I stand with Juan de la Cruz.
NPA yan for sure. Dapat nang mahuli. #Justice.
Tutol ako dahil pahirap lang ito sa mga low-income bracket.
Pabor! Panahon na para ma-improve iyong agri natin.
Dapat mag-igpit ang seguridad. Makita, saka alam mo kasi mayroong mga medical studies pala siya sa tao. Kaya naman,
Kanang inyong mga cellphone, pagbantay mo sa inyong mga isultihan ta na mo sa una. Pornography is a spiritual adultery. Kanang pornography, labaw pa na sa shabu. Magdaot imong uto ka na, labi na kung ikaw niya ka sa kingdom ministry, pahingon taglangit, mo na imong kalaban. Because it will destroy everything that was implanted to you spiritually that will let you go to heaven. Pornography is the number one missile of the enemy that will destroy you and your soul to hell. Ayaw jud mo pagtanaw pornography, babaeng lalaki sa inyo. What is dangerous now with cell phones? You can go into the privacy of your room and look at your cell phone without anyone. Only God knows what are you looking at. And mostly, people go to the dark side of the door going to destruction to hell. And that is pornography. It destroys the mind. It destroys the soul. It destroys your spirit.
Welcome back to SMNI. This is Business and Politics. Professor Rene, another recent visitor to China was the French President Emmanuel Macron. And this has been getting a lot of news lately because he seems to be out of step with the rest of Europe and certainly out of step with the United States. But his message seems to be about what they call de-risking, which sounds similar to what you were saying a while ago about diversifying, right? Don't depend on one country. I guess that was Europe's lesson with Ukraine and Russia. They were overly dependent on Russia for their energy requirements. So they're talking about possibly de-risking, and the opposite side, or the alternative to that, would be decoupling from China, which I think something that may be heard from the United States these days. What do you think? What is the more prudent approach, I think, from the Philippine perspective?
Again, this is really, every action you take would have certain consequences.
Sure.
Macron is now, of course, facing the backlash from the European Union and even from Germany.
Yes.
So he had to suffer the consequence of that possible action. Again, whether he could push through or not with that, his initiative will depend, of course, on his determination.
Yeah.
So that's also our case. You have, of course, those opportunities and challenges facing us, and every action you take will always have, of course, consequences, backlash, so forth and so on. So what really matters at the end of the day is the willingness of your leaders to take that risk.
Yeah, I wonder if you've been following that initiative of China to maybe press for some peace talks in Ukraine, and this was something that was also discussed during Macron's visit, that maybe we should not be so dismissive about China's policy, because the West was right, because it didn't have any provisions on returning Ukraine lands, but still the point was maybe to sit down and talk about it. I know the whole world is skeptical, but Emmanuel Macron was somehow willing to give it a chance. What do you think? Should there be something there given China's role in the South China Sea, and is there
well, specifically, if we focus on Ukraine, I think before you will have any breakthrough in terms of peace negotiation, we might still have to be settled on the battlefield.
Okay.
If the Ukrainians will be able to inflict a major victory against the Russians at a certain point, then both sides will start negotiating. You know, that's a possibility. But again, at this point in time, if you have to look at what's happening in Europe, what's happening in Ukraine, this is, you know, whatever major developments would happen, will still have to be settled in the battlefield.
Yeah, because I think people who were skeptical about the Chinese initiative in Ukraine would probably be surprised to hear that that China also played a sort of a peacemaking role that led to the restoration of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And of course, this is very beneficial to the Philippines because it gives more stability to that region where we have millions of workers.
Sure.
Something that the United States was not able to do. But should we be maybe encouraging China to do that? And maybe, do you think, because as you said, they don't have to listen to anybody else because they're the bigger power, should we be encouraging that in the hopes of maybe this will spill over?
Yes, we have to use the power of moral suasion.
Yeah.
To impress upon China, you have the oldest civilization.
Yeah.
You have, you know, you're the largest country in the region.
Yeah.
You have the second largest economy in the world. So it's your responsibility to ensure that there'll be peace and stability.
Okay.
Because in the long run, geography, history favors you if you want to become, of course, a great power to, you know, be respected. But as a great power, you also have responsibility.
Right.
So we could try that approach. Whether that will work or not, we simply don't know.
Right.
If we could basically generate in China that sense that any great power in the past would also have to recognize its responsibility to the other powers.
But do you think that maybe that message would resonate more in China if it was not just the Philippines talking, but maybe as
ASEAN? That's the role of ASEAN. Hopefully that will be the message of ASEAN.
But do you think that's possible? And maybe the follow-up to that, would China even welcome a more unified ASEAN? Because you know,
that's another challenge.
Some people may say that China would not want a strong ASEAN. They would prefer to be fragmented.
If you'll have also realization in China that this is a better path than, of course, a major conflict against the United States.
Okay.
So sometimes, of course, the fear of conflict might force a great power to basically take the different approach.
Okay.
So that's what happened during the Cold War.
How do we influence that? I mean, because we are a founding member of ASEAN, but of course ASEAN has this policy of non-interference. I mean,
No, it's external in ASEAN. We have to... there was, of course, an attempt by Indonesia for ASEAN to come out with an Indo-Pacific strategy, but of course it failed, unfortunately, on the part of Indonesia, primarily because each ASEAN country has already their respective policy vis-a-vis dealing with the great powers.
Right.
So ASEAN member states paid lip service to the Indo-Pacific outlook, of Indonesia. So I think this could be a start. Indonesia will be the chair of ASEAN this year. So it can engage Indonesia to how ASEAN could hopefully use moral suasion. Of course, ASEAN has been using moral suasion on China for several decades. It has not yet worked because our calculation is just like, a middle power, any other middle power, China will be persuaded. We simply failed to take into account China views developments here from the perspective of great power.
Now, let me ask you about the domestic policy as implications of what we're talking about, because you obviously advise senior people to our security departments, also our diplomats. Diplomacy is not an easy easy game. But do you think the Filipino diplomats and security personnel are up to the task in maybe navigating a safe way for the Philippines that serve our interests without necessarily making it worse for everyone in the world?
Yeah, we have the best.
We have the skills.
We have the skills. We have that institutional knowledge. But of course, the main challenge, the main problem, this was raised by some of my friends, especially in the diplomatic corps, is they tend to be risk adverse.
Okay.
So this is something that, of course, the armed forces, and even, of course, the diplomatic service will have to take into account in this very challenging moment.
Right.
We have to basically take sometimes necessary risks.
Right. And something related to that, there's been a shift in military policy in the Philippines, where they used to focus on internal security. Now they're focused on protecting our international interests, our national borders. What's your take on that? Of course, from China's perspective, this can be interpreted as something very aggressive, but for us, it only makes sense, right? What do you think of that policy?
That's, it's long overdue.
Okay.
In fact, the policy began during the time of the Aquino administration.
Okay.
2012, after the Scarborough Shoal standoff, you have some money, you have, of course, some policy directing it, but then, of course, at the end of the day, during the Aquino administration, there was a question of whether there's enough money. President Duterte put his money where his mouth is. President Marcos, basically, it's really high time that we really shift. It's high time that we have to back our diplomacy with a credible military capability. Diplomacy is the velvet glove that covers the iron fist of the military capability.
Okay.
So at least at a credible level, we should develop it so that we could not simply rely on our alliance.
Right.
Alliance is convenient, but at the same time, at the end of the day, the responsibility of defending our country, backing our diplomacy, would be, of course, on the hands of the armed forces of the Philippines.
Okay. Now, something that may be related to that is this whole discussion about reviving ROTC, right? Do you see that connection, or do you see that as something separate?
It's connected.
Separate altogether?
We have to educate our youth.
Okay.
We have to prepare our youth for possible eventualities.
Okay, right.
So that's a way of also maintaining national cohesion and, more importantly, patriotism.
Right. Now, how do we instill that in our young people? Because we have this young generation. I don't know what generation, X or Y or they're a lot of people my age view them as something
Our
very
age.
something very
Our age.
something very different. I don't pretend to understand that generation, but how do we instill that, as you said, nationalism, that concern for the Philippines? What is the best way? Is it through ROTC? Is it through something else?
Education.
Yeah.
Development of
culture?
civic culture.
Okay.
Not just culture, civic culture.
Okay.
Starting, of course, in the primary education.
Okay.
Also, of course, making people generally aware of the happening and the need, of course, for national cohesion.
Okay. Okay. And
we have to believe in something.
Yeah.
That should be the basis of our national existence.
Yeah, and that's the point. But how do we unite the Filipinos, right? When there are so many things that seemingly divide us.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, that's where, of course, what our president has been calling for.
Okay.
National unity. He started with that, campaign slogan, national unity.
Okay.
And he is stuck with it during the campaign period. Now, of course, he's the president. That is, of course, his primary task.
Right. Do you think it's something realistic? Do you think it's something that can be done?
We have to give him the benefit of the doubt.
Okay. Okay.
We have to believe in what he's saying, or nothing will happen.
Right. So we have to believe in ourselves. I think
Yes,
is the
and of
first
course, the
step.
importance of national unity. We can have discussion, we can have debate, we could criticize certain aspects of the country's foreign policy, but at the end of the day, we have to understand we constitute one Filipino nation.
That's very well said. Professor, it's been very nice to have you here in Business and Politics. I hope that we can talk some more, but
sure, I'm at your beck and call.
Our time tonight has expired, but before we go, maybe you'd like to leave us a message for our audience?
Well, that's a point I raised, that we have a president here who started, in his time that he started his candidacy, is always saying only one thing.
Okay.
National unity, national unity. Of course, he became the president. At the onset of his presidency, already acknowledged the ruling.
Okay.
And of course, had made decisions that was aimed to maintain a balanced foreign policy. So let's give him that chance. Let's give him a chance to succeed. But we can only give him the chance to succeed if we support his policy, no matter how, whether it's controversial or not. We only have one president and one country.
We have to do our part.
We have to do our part.
Well, thank you very much, Rene. I'd like to thank our viewers watching this program, those watching live and watching the replay. I'd also like to thank Pastor Apollo Kibuloy for making this program possible. This has been Business and Politics. I will see you next week.